This is part two of an introduction to person centered care and person centered recovery planning. In part one, we went over the basic information about the course, introduced the 4 P's of PCRP, and covered two: philosophy and product. In this part, we focus on process. As a review, the 4 P's of person centered recovery planning are philosophy, product, process, and plan. The process P of PCRP covers a lot: how different kinds of supporters can be involved in PCRP, and what really characterizes a PCRP approach in practice, without getting too far into the specifics of a written plan. Let's dive in. At its core, a PCRP process focuses on the person's strengths and their vision of the future. We will go through this section on process, mapping each of these principles to specific ways of working. These principles are person-centered care principles within recovery-oriented care. They are: planning is strengths-based and empowering. Relationships are central. Care is community-focused, collaborative, and inclusive. As we get started with this section, we want to make an important note about PCRP process. Because it is defined by individual preferences, influenced by agency procedures and situational context, it will always look a bit different. PCRP can be done with people navigating a crisis, in ongoing community-based care, in inpatient settings. So there is no one prescribed sequence of steps or ways of working. The good news about this variation is that it allows for enormous individualization and creativity. At the end of this section, we will share a tool to help you maintain quality in the process you are facilitating. A PCRP process is strengths-based and empowering. Well, it sounds nice. Let's really examine this and consider some examples. When we talk about a PCRP process being strengths-based, we mean that it has a strengths orientation overall. The entire approach is about moving toward a life worth living. It considers the whole person. It does capture the person's abilities and their identity. It celebrates what's going well. Strengths really help us provide truly individualized, meaningful care and support. A portrait of a person and their strengths is central to a PCRP process. And as we discussed when first presenting the idea of recovery, someone navigating mental health services has often been through a lot. They've often lost hope and a sense of self-efficacy. So that picture of the person often needs to be developed over time and as supporters get to know someone as a whole person. Let's get a feel for what we mean by a comprehensive portrait of someone. First, we'll take a look at a traditional approach. The client is a 34-year-old white female diagnosed with schizophrenia, paranoid type, with a history of substance use, homelessness, and 8 inpatient psychiatric hospitalizations beginning in 2013. She has been compliant with medication and stable in the community for the last year. Get a writing utensil, jot down some notes. Identify some of the strengths in this traditional approach to a narrative description. What can you find? What we found was the reference to medication compliance and stability in the community for 1 year. Based on our conversations thus far, what specifically is lacking here? You might have a general impression. See if you can identify anything very specific that's missing. Part of this, we believe, is a sense of who the person is and what they value, their strengths outside the service system, a whole person perspective. Who is this person? Let's try a person centered approach. Missy is a middle aged New Yorker who loves watching WWE wrestling, visiting with neighbors, and listening to country music. She's funny, outgoing, and is known at the group home as someone you can really lean on when times get tough. Missy has made a lot of changes in her life since last year. At that time, she was feeling quite hopeless with a string of housing placements that hadn't worked out, and many hospitalizations at psychiatric facilities and emergency rooms. Life had become so overwhelming for her, she even began to experiment with stimulants which she bought from a neighbor to give her a boost. But that ultimately only worsened her feelings of anxiety and fearfulness of others. So do the same thing. Take a few minutes to identify some of the strengths noted in this person centered approach to a narrative description. What can you find? A few things are that she likes music, wrestling, socializing, she's funny, she's outgoing. Based on our conversations thus far, what do you think might be the costs and benefits of this approach? Just jot down your own thoughts about this. Some of the sample costs that we thought about were there are more words here. There's also more analysis. It's more descriptive. So it might take more time. Some of the benefits might be that it's more individualized, it's more about the whole person, and it's actually more specific. You'll see this more in the section on the plan, the written document, but some of those sample benefits are likely to come into play as you're more fully developing a written plan and the comprehensive care that the person may benefit from. So let's try this exercise. Write a person centered narrative on yourself. So, using Missy's example as a model, try and write a person centered narrative on yourself, making note of your interests, skills, resources, and the challenges you face. Once you've done that, maybe you hit pause in the video if you want to give yourself a few minutes. Use the traditional example as a model and try to write a narrative on yourself that way. And when you're ready, read these two examples, just paying attention to what you notice about them. We believe that just paying attention to your own experience, you can get a sense of the impact of these kinds of portraits. In part one, Amanda Bowman spoke about the early changes her team made when implementing PCRP and the impact that using a person's name instead of the term client or patient had within their culture. The rest of the portrait involves really understanding someone's identity well beyond diagnostic or clinical information. It's about a whole person. As we begin to appreciate who a person is, what they value, and their strengths, we can begin to understand what they might believe would be a good life. It is also important to understand that when we think about high expectations and the pursuit of a good life, these are the kinds of things we might be talking about. Not things like staying out of the hospital, which is important, but not quite as motivating as things like reconnecting with family, or, for example, reducing assaultive behavior. That might be important, but it may not be quite as motivating or connecting to as something when thinking about getting their own place, reconnecting with loved ones, getting a job where they get to learn good stuff, having a partner. This topic and how we can bring the notion of high expectations into PCRP is discussed in the Plan Components Course 2. PCRP follows the lead of the person and what they know to be their sense of a good life. In order to follow the lead of the person, we need to understand who they are as a whole person in the community that they want to be a part of. In person centered care, we address what might be considered important for the person and important to the person. On the left hand side of this visual, you can see that important for the person, they're critical things. They're things like a person's legal obligations and mandates and their basic health and safety. On the right hand side, you can see that what is considered important to the person are things like their meaningful relationships, their faith, maybe their career or vocation. In order for us to develop meaningful care and support that is truly individualized, we have to understand what is important to the person, what is motivating to them. Typically, what we find is most motivating to people, even if they believe that something on the left, something like their legal obligations, is important for them. What is more deeply motivating tends to be their independence, their relationships, and the things that we find on the right-hand side under important to the person. In this story, Ebony Flint provides a very clear example of one person's sense of a high quality of life and how she supported her to pursue that.
Quality of life for someone that could be there was a person who, because they were on so many different types of psychiatric drugs for so long, they had tremors, and there was nothing they could do about it. Their hands would shake excessively, but all they wanted to do was get their nails done. So one of the great things I get to do as a peer specialist is find ways that they could get their nails done. And I didn't just do that. I found a place that opened at like 7 in the morning. I sat down with them and explained what it was so that she wasn't judged or told to stop shaking. And we would go, every month and get our nails done. And the smile on her face, how she would look forward to it. Eventually, it got to where she would get dressed and excited to go. And how that was a thing was because that was not just something that she wasn't interested in doing, but it was also something that was hard because it was forced, in the home she was in. And oh, you need to shower, you need to do this. So here we were doing something that also helped in these other ways without it being, you have to do this in order for us to get our nails done. You have to, back to the consequences, because we tie all those things together, right? I tie it together, and those who I've supported tie it together. Those who I've supported tie it together too, in that what is it? Negative, reinforcing negative messages. And there are different ways that that's done, you know.
This visual, which should look familiar, compares the focus of a recovery and person centered service system and the focus of a more traditional system. As we consider the empowering part of this subsection, we want to emphasize a few things. In a person centered, recovery oriented system, we emphasize participation, high expectations, but also on meaningful risk taking as a fundamental aspect of learning and growth, as a fundamental right. This shift away from low expectations and protection from failure is a significant culture shift for the care that is being provided. A PCRP process is strengths based and it's also empowering. People have a right to control decisions that impact their lives. Relationships and planning are based on respect and the presumption that people are competent to know what they like and have a right to control decisions that impact their lives. One of the central shifts in focus is this idea that each person has that right to learn and grow, to make mistakes, to take risks. To change, to evolve, one must try new things and risk some degree of failure. Dr. Patricia Deegan, a highly influential advocate, psychologist, and person with lived experience, describes this. All human beings need the opportunity and freedom to learn from their own mistakes. Therefore, in circumstances that don't pose serious and imminent risk to the person or others, direct supports accordingly afford individuals the dignity of risk and the right to failure. Amy shares a vivid story about taking an important risk when she was a young adult. In her story, pay attention to how she related to her treatment team in this process.
It was a part-time job at the family center. And at the family center, basically what that job was on the weekends is you showed people where to go, right? They came to visits, where to go, and you answer the phone. I could do that. I knew that campus like the back of my hand. And I was excited. I went to tell my treatment team, and then they thought I was getting unwell and they wanted to have my medications. And I was like, I knew I could do this. I knew all of this. And, I think there was that concern because I had been out of the hospital this long. There was this stability. I was on disability. I was living on my own to take on something that could have been stressful. But for me, that was like getting to go to work. That was exciting. And getting to do that job, I felt confident in it. But I didn't tell them that I actually applied for it. I didn't tell them when I got it. And I actually ended up leaving services without saying anything. Because I was afraid they were going to put me in the hospital because I was delusional. And I know that today I know that's not the truth. But in those moments, I really had this fear that if I told them that I'd actually done this, that I could get a commitment put on me again. Because that was my experience that happened over and over.
As you heard, Amy's story connects directly to her pursuit of a life in the community. And unfortunately, she wasn't confident that her treatment team would support her choice to try something new for her at the time, a job. It was one that she felt confident that she could do, but she wasn't confident in her team. How can our services and supports more clearly prioritize people's pursuit of a life in the community, even if it involves taking risks? It isn't always straightforward, but it is worthwhile. This idea of the dignity of risk and the related idea that everyone has a right to failure are deceptively simple sometimes. In real life circumstances, we defer to agency policy, consultation with colleagues, and good supervision to help us navigate circumstances where this arises. To help with this, we like to use this continuum of over-control and neglect, which was first introduced by recovery leader, psychologist, and person with lived experience, Dr. Patricia Deegan. On one end, you see over control, sometimes called coercion or toxic help, and the other end, neglect. You can imagine that in complex circumstances, our impulses often move to either try to over control the situation or the person's actions, or move way back and do absolutely nothing. We throw up our hands. What are we aiming for in supporting recovery? We really think of it as an engaged stance of partnership. You can see it in the middle of the visual here. Actions that best support recovery. Let's work with this concept. You might want a piece of paper and something to write with as you go through this. Think of the people you're currently working to support. Is there someone for whom this balance is especially challenging because you slip toward over control or neglect? What are the circumstances, concerns, or external pressures that influence your work with this person? Write down your thoughts on these dynamics. You can pause the video if that's helpful to you. What are some of the strategies you have found to help you maintain perspective and could support this balance? Some of the most commonly used strategies to support this balance are supportive supervision, consultation with colleagues, and approaches that support the care and the well-being of a practitioner. It's very difficult to maintain an engaged but not over-controlling or maintaining enough disengagement that we're not trying to influence too much, but we're still in the process with a person. And we're not just so far back that we're neglecting the relationship and neglecting the partnership when we're not very well ourselves and we're not able to nourish and maintain our own sense of balance. As is clear in Amy's story and in the exercise we just went through, skilled supporters are aware of themselves and their own biases, and they're also aware of the biases embedded in the service system. To support the person, understanding how the person's values, one's own and the system, may be misaligned in certain moments, makes it more possible to offer people the individualized support that is most relevant to their circumstances as they arise. In this example, Amanda Bowman tells a story of a time when she worked on a team that supported a woman who didn't want some of the supports that were offered, and how the team responded.
There was an individual that was hospitalized, and she was in pretty bad shape when she came into the hospital. She wasn't able to communicate much. Um, she was really functioning and experiencing things that, other people were not seeing or hearing. And it took a month or two of, you know, providing a supportive environment, and there was psychiatric medication involved before she was really able to articulate what she wanted, and we really saw who she was, personality, got to know her. And at the end of that couple of months, she conveyed that she did not want our offer for stable housing. She had lived a life where she traveled quite a bit, and she didn't want to be tied down with the responsibilities of a job or a permanent residence. And she had been on an involuntary commitment, and so she was doing well enough. She was no longer a danger to herself or others, except she was choosing to return to the same lifestyle that had led her um, to being admitted and to the condition that we had originally met her in. And the psychiatrist that, was serving as the leader of the treatment team and had the final say over discharge readiness was really, really concerned about her safety and discharging her without, a good discharge plan. And we asked for consultation with another treatment team because we really felt like it was inappropriate, some of us on the team, to hold someone against their will because we thought they were making a bad decision. And that was one of the times, we had a feeling that she was going to return to that state that she had been in, but that was her decision to make, that it's her life, it was her right to make that decision, and that she was making that decision, from a place of capacity. She knew what she wanted. It just wasn't what we thought was best for her. And so I think that's one of the moments I can remember sitting around and having a consultation session to really name what our hesitations were and ethically how important it was to grant her a release from the hospital with a discharge plan that really was non-existent. It was like a 30-day supply of medication and, really kind of doing some planning, just for some crisis type planning on the way out the door. But that was what was appropriate and legal and person-centered.
We have talked a lot about community. To summarize some of the key points, PCRP process focuses on the person's own vision of the life they want to lead, including the involvement of professional and natural supports and the distinct importance of each. The creation of maintenance of a meaningful life in the community is fundamental. It's a right rather than a privilege to be earned by demonstration of stability or acts of compliance. Without going into the nuts and bolts of plans and documentation, let's consider the kind of understanding you need to have of a person in order to support their life in the community. In a moment, we will show you some information about a person named Jason. As you read through the information, consider: what does the summary tell you about Jason's identity? What information might help you understand what could be important to his quality of life in the community outside of services? How is the information you read in Jason's story similar and different from the kind of information you discuss with people receiving services and is documented in their plans? To what extent is the information you currently have helping you support people to pursue a life in the community as they envision it, in addition to clinical information? What might need to change? Let's take a look. Jason is a talented artist, producing as many as 30 realistic pencil drawings a week, with a few selling for $250 at a local art gallery. He has fond memories of playing basketball with his father in his youth, but is now disconnected from family and reports feeling lonely without any significant friendships or supports outside of paid providers. He enjoys nature and people watching around town, but never feels comfortable approaching anyone, stating he creeps people out due to slowed speech from medication side effects and occasional experiences of seeing people who other people don't see, which can distract him during conversations, but can also be comforting when alone. He often dreams about what life could be like being in a community of local artists, maybe even teaching a drawing class to teens. He says, "I know I should appreciate my physical health and stability given the dark times I've had from the depression and psychosis, but I feel like my life is missing something." He's had significant periods of being unhoused, but has maintained his own apartment that he likes for 2 years now. He's been connected to this outpatient program for 5 years. Now that you've read the information, take a few minutes and write down your answers. What does the summary tell you about Jason's identity? What information might help you understand what could be important to his quality of life in the community outside of services? How is the information you read in Jason's story similar and different from the kind of information you discuss with people receiving services and is documented in their plans? To what extent is the information you currently have helping you support people to pursue a life in the community as they envision it, in addition to clinical information? And what might need to change? It is very common that professional supporters either think it's not really their job, like they're not justified in providing support toward that community life that's envisioned, that their job is really about functioning in the most traditional sense. Or they have a rich relationship with the person and have a really strong sense of what they care about, but it's not really what's supposed to go in the documentation. We'll talk a lot more about documentation in the written plan section, and it's the focus of the plan components course. But the kind of information you see in Jason's story can lead to the articulation of a specific goal or vision that the plan is built around, and it lays the groundwork for a highly individualized plan, which is reflected in documentation. So the more that you really understand someone's vision of a community life, of who they are, how they want to live their life in the community, the better support you can arrange and provide and coordinate on their behalf and alongside them. Relationships are central to life in one's community, in one's healing, and in one's care. How do we support people in developing deeper relationships and connections? We will first start with the kinds of supporters one might have in their life, and then look at cultivating relationships and connections. We primarily think about 2 types of supporters in PCRP, and they're both involved. The first that we will talk about is professional, probably you if you're taking this course. Professional supports are service providers who are paid to provide specific support to a person either through mental health system or another care system like physical health. The second is natural supporters, the people in someone's everyday life. These are loved ones, friends, community members, spiritual leaders, and others that are involved in a person's life. They've been identified by the person whose planning process it is as a natural support outside the system. Sometimes natural supporters are described as someone's chosen family. PCRP involves natural supporters to the extent and in the ways that the person desires. Person-centered planning also emphasizes the development and maintenance of meaningful relationships and community engagement through a variety of activities and connections. Professional supporters know the array of local community resources and make formal linkages when it's appropriate and desired. They're also well-oriented to the dynamics and particular issues related to people that they serve, the populations that they serve, and can meaningfully navigate and support the person with respect to relevant linguistic and cultural characteristics. When providing professional support, the data is clear. The relationship between someone receiving services and their provider is more influential than any specific clinical approach. Without it, our evidence-based practices and treatments aren't nearly as effective. So investing in that relationship is worth your time and energy. Dr. Patricia Deegan's research about what really made a difference included People understanding that others believed in their potential to live better lives. Letting a person know that you care about them and believe in their potential. Being kind and demonstrating respect, and emphasizing what the person does well. Getting in the driver's seat of your treatment is a tool that was created to help originally to help peer support staff in their work alongside people in services, specifically preparing for person-centered planning. Anyone, though, in a supporting role can use the tool meaningfully with someone who is receiving services. There's one exercise we find particularly useful when thinking about the importance of relationships in one's recovery. That tool is called the Circles of Support, and it invites people to reflect on their network of support. As you can see here, the exercise invites someone to consider not only who they are closest to, but who's part of their broader community. To get a feel for how the circles of support might feel for someone receiving services, do your own. Take some time and think about who's in your inner circle. Jot down who would you think of when you think about those that you would turn to or you might include in your own planning process. Your chosen family, your natural supporters. And then who are some of those people that you might know from hobbies, work, just stuff out in the community that you could develop more of a connection with, but you haven't? These are people that also might eventually be part of your support team, but right now, you don't know them that well. And then last, who is it that's meaningful to you, but isn't necessarily close? For some people, this might include faith leaders. This might be people that they admire in the community that they know and see, and they're always happy to see, but they're just not that close. We really want to see a pretty good variety of relationships across all these spheres and circles. Obviously, different people have different relationship styles, and some people they have a million sort of loose connections and very few people that they're close to. So, affording a lot of range and difference, think about, are there areas that seem particularly strong to you? Do you have a lot of people in your inner circle? I know I have a lot of people in my inner circle, but I don't have that many people in the outer circle. I'm particularly bad about cultivating connections in the middle circle. Are there circles that you would like to cultivate? Maybe you just want to develop some more relationships and you want to seek out some time with people that you don't know well, but you think are pretty cool. The main thing here is to get a feel for what is this experience like of reflecting on your own circles of support. And given what we know about people in recovery and some of the people that might be receiving care and some of the disconnected relationships that they may have, what are some of the sensitivities that you might need to consider when facilitating this exercise? The last aspect of the PCRP process we want to emphasize is that it is collaborative and it is inclusive. A PCRP process centers the person, is created around their needs, and follows their lead. Part of this relates to facilitating meetings and conversations with people in any of their natural supporters in a way that really follows the preferences of the person. It guarantees that they remain the primary focus, their priorities, their perspectives. If visual tools, anything that will help improve communication and dialogue can be useful, they're employed. The process attends to the language and respects the preferences of the person and their use of language, including the nuances between person first and identity first language. Thinking about involving the person and really following their lead, there are many influences and often barriers to a person's participation in care and planning, though. To ensure the process really centers the person, we have to consider this so that we can tailor the approach to the person and their circumstances. Consider their individual and cultural preferences, their current experience of symptoms, what might be at play in any one conversation with them from day to day, their general communication abilities and confidence, the trust that they have with their supporters. Just because they're involving people in their process doesn't mean that they have a high degree of support or trust with the people involved. Part of the role of a supporter may be to facilitate some trust building and helping create the circumstances that can develop when it serves the person. Past experiences with services can significantly impact someone's involvement in care. So can their readiness or motivation to commit to a particular change or action. Related to this, a good PCRP supporter or facilitator has self-awareness and cultural humility, understanding the significant power dynamics at play in any helping relationship, but specifically the dynamics with this person. Many people are familiar with the idea of person-first language. Fewer are familiar with identity first. Person-first language puts the person first in a description. For example, instead of referring to someone as they might have been referred to historically, as schizophrenic, instead, a person is referred to as someone living with schizophrenia, or might say, I'm someone who lives with schizophrenia. Similarly, a person might be referred to as someone who is currently unhoused or someone who is experiencing homelessness instead of the person being referred to as a homeless person. Identity-first language is a way of referring to people that emphasizes a core part of their identity, such as a disability. For example, a person might say, I'm an alcoholic, or they might say, as an autistic person. Primarily, we want to follow the person's own language and respect that they should be referred to in the ways that work for them. If you are coordinating and facilitating a PCRP process, keep in mind that part of your role is helping the person consider who is in their team, supporting them around changing that team when they need to, and helping everyone contribute meaningfully. Your relationship with the person whose plan it is primary, but the relationships you have with their team members are also very important. Some people may need encouragement and guidance to understand how they can contribute. Others may need help to move back and make space for other people in the group. To some extent, how you facilitate meetings is common sense given the philosophy that underlies PCRP, but it can be a lot of pieces to manage. Ensuring that all members of the team speak in a way that centers the person, without talking about them as though they aren't in the room, may require some respectful nudging and adjustment. Also, keeping clinical aspects of the conversation directed at their relevance to the person's goals is important and can be difficult. There will be more on this aspect of PCRP in the course on plan components with respect to keeping barriers relevant and specific. To close out the process P of the 4 Ps, we want to offer you a valuable supporting tool for maintaining quality in a PCRP process. The Recovery Roadmap Toolkit was developed by the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health. There are 4 guides. 2 are focused on PCRP process and 2 are focused on the plan. There are 2 guides for each because one is for staff and one is designed for use by people receiving services. We have found that the recovery roadmap tools are great for bringing into team meetings, supervision, and helping prepare people receiving services for both the process and the documentation side of PCRP. The content of the plan documentation guides align closely with the course plan components. The process elements are a nice way as a facilitator to keep specific process elements in mind. We encourage you to take a look. We are at the end of part 2 of an introduction to person-centered care and person-centered recovery planning, the focus of which was the PCRP process. In part 3, we will look at the written document, the 4th P, plan, and wrap up the course.